After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." For a 21st century American, this lake behind me doesn't really look that scary. I mean, there's some mean-looking geese nearby, but other than that, there's not a whole lot to really frighten you. But if you were in Jesus' day in Israel, when you see a body of water like this, what you think of is the beginning of the book of Genesis, when God forms the earth out of a formless wasteland. And God set the earth on its foundation, and that foundation was over a great abyss. And that abyss represented the possibility of nothingness, the possibility of death. And when you look into the depths of that water, because you don't have scuba gear, you don't have a submarine, you can't go down and see what's at the very bottom, you just see the depths of nothingness. And so as Jesus commands his disciples to go out on the boat, and he knows that there's a storm that's going to take place, we see in this gospel Jesus praying on the mountain, this solid figure, and then we see the wind and the waves and almost this personification of primordial fear that the disciples are headed straight into, as they have been commanded to do. And this is what's crazy, is that Jesus commands his disciples to go onto the sea, knowing full well what will happen, knowing that they will be tempted to believe that he is not present to them in the midst of their fears. Now, often we talk about these things, we talk about the wind and the waves, and we begin to talk about them in such a way that it sounds like we're almost dismissing or disparaging the fears. Now, anybody who thinks that way, I challenge you to go out on a boat and have these 20-foot swells of water swamping the boat that you're in, and the wind howling, and it be nighttime, and it's almost as if the entire sea is raging against you. That wind and those waves were real. Our fears are real. But Jesus commands his disciples to face their fears. Why? So that we can have an experience of God in person, commanding the wind and the waves, and know that Jesus Christ is God. You know, there were these ancient myths the people who surrounded the Israelites had. One is called the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish is this battle between good and evil, and you don't know which one is going to win. And this story of the wind and the waves and of God himself walking on the water almost sounds like it's going to be one of those where it's this ancient battle between good and evil, and one is on top and the other's on top, and you're not sure who's going to win. But it turns out that's not the story at all. It turns out Jesus is God, and God is infinitely greater than the evil that we face in our lives. And as real as it is to us, and as emotionally and subjectively we experience our fears, God is God, and he's greater than these things. And so it's such a great thing to pray with this passage. This is one of my favorite passages to pray with, especially as we hear this intimate conversation between Jesus and Peter. And at first it maybe, seems like this kind of soft, nice little talk, Peter saying, "Hey, Jesus, if that's really you, call me to come out onto the water." But remember, the wind and the waves are raging at this moment. Their conversation is over and across and amidst all of the fears, all of the raging, all of the evils that are going on. That needs to be our prayer. You know, if we were Buddhist, we would find ways to kind of soothe and calm everything over and realize that, you know, this evil really isn't something that we can change, and just learn to kind of be at one with everything. But we're not. We're Christians. And especially in the life of discernment, whether it's discernment of our vocation, whether it's discernment of what we're called to do next, discernment of how we're called to grow, Jesus Christ is going to command us to face our fears. And we're not going to want to. We're not going to want to look them directly in the face. But Jesus commands us. Why? Because he wants us to grow into trusting disciples. You know, as I was praying with this passage earlier, it really bothered me what Jesus says to Peter. You know, so Peter, he looks away from Jesus, and then he begins to sink, and then he calls out, "Lord, save me," which, of course, he knows who to turn to save him. And then Jesus grabs a hold of him, and he immediately rebukes him. He says, "Oh, you of little faith." And at first I'm like, really? Like, you're going to rebuke the one who was willing to go out onto the wind and the waves? When he calls out to you, the first thing that you're going to tell him is almost a criticism. But in reality, as I prayed with it and wrestled with the passage, I realized that Jesus was saying, you need to have more confidence in me. You need to keep your eyes fixed on my face. When you look around at this wind and these waves, you need to focus on me. And so in discernment, in spiritual growth, we're going to be confronted with the things that we fear the most. Maybe there are fears that if I take this specific decision, I'll miss out on so much. If I move in this direction, I will confront my own unworthiness. Well, guess what? You are going to confront your own unworthiness. We all, as disciples, do. Maybe it's this encounter with our own temptations. Maybe it's an encounter with those things that have occurred in the past. Whatever it is, those are just like that abyss over which the earth was planted. And we know that left to our own devices, we're just going to sink. We're going to drown. We will be overwhelmed because our fears are real and they're adequate. But here comes stepping into our lives, the one who commands peace. And often when he commands peace, it's simply an interior peace. Exteriorly, things are still raging. The wind is still going, the storm's still going, the waves are still washing in. But interiorly, he commands a peace so that we can navigate through our lives, so that we can arrive at the place that he desires us to go. St. John Paul II said over and over again, "Be not afraid," repeating the words of Jesus. Not in a way that dismissed fears. It said, you know, your fears aren't real, they don't matter. That dialogue between Jesus and Peter over and across and amidst that wind and that waves, that was a real dialogue. And it needed to take place in precisely that place. We know that later on, of course, Jesus is going to dialogue with St. John as John is laying on the breast of Jesus. And that's good. We need to have those moments. But we also need to have those dialogues across the stern of the boat where we're calling out to the one who we're not even sure if he's there. And we're saying, Lord, if that's you, command me. Command me to walk towards you. Command me to not run away from my fears, but to confront them, not by myself, but with you. And if we do that, everything's going to be great.